Perfect timing as well. Thank you, Mr. Harris, for that testimony. The chair will now recognize members for 5 minutes of questions, and I'd like to begin by recognizing the gentlewoman from the state of Wyoming and former chair of Indian Insular Affairs, Ms. Hageman, for 5 minutes. Ms. Hageman.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd and Ranking Member Leger-Fernandez. It's wonderful to be back here in this committee room addressing economic development issues. I just first want to say something in response to the tirade from Mr. Huffman. I believe really got off track, but I think there's some important things to point out here. First of all, personal safety and economic development are interrelated, and we need personal safety and tribal safety in order to have economic development on our reservations. Yet it was under the Biden administration that they threw open the border, and as a result, we ended up in circumstances where we had a couple of hearings where various leaders from different tribes came and talked about the impact of the drug cartels invading the reservations and the consequences of that. Under Kash Patel, I have specifically and personally spoken to him, made sure that this was a priority, that security and safety on our reservations and for our tribal members was a very high priority for this administration. I want to assure you that Kash Patel, the FBI director, has indicated that it is so, and I hope that he is working with our reservation and our tribal leaders to make sure that we can keep our members safe and secure. Thank you for allowing me to wave on to today's hearing. Tribal economic development was one of my top priorities during my tenure last Congress as this subcommittee chair, and I do appreciate your leadership on this issue. Chairwoman Silvas, I very much appreciate you coming here, but also something that you mentioned in your testimony is so important to myself as well as Ranking Member Leger-Fernandez, and that is H.R. 5910. We are working together to pass that. That is a bill that would allow our tribes to lease their lands for up to 99 years. That is advanced out of this committee and passed the House last Congress, and it has again been reported by this committee so that we can get that passed in the House. I am hoping that we can, or that get it passed in the Senate. I am working on that now because I know that that is a very important opportunity for many of our tribal members. Ms. Silvas, could you please speak to the opportunities that this policy change may open up for your tribe if you're able to lease your lands for 99 years?
Yes, I believe that tribes should be able to control their own lands, and we believe that we are smart enough to make those decisions and make those negotiations and be able to choose those leasing terms.
Ms. Silvas, I absolutely agree with you. And that's why one of the reasons why we have worked so hard to push that forward. I have visited with leadership from various tribes over the years as to the benefits that would provide. If you talk to the folks with Agua Caliente in Southern California, the success model the business model that they have been able to put forward because the 99-year lease opportunity has really benefited the members there. Mr. Chairman Butler, I would like to turn to you real quickly. And as you noticed, the federal policy response to COVID opened up new tribal opportunities in departments and agencies that lacked experience working with tribal governments or tribal communities. This has been a frustration of mine since I first went on to the subcommittee and understanding the challenges with that government-to-government relationship. And could you please describe how an agency's misunderstanding of tribal sovereignty and the government-to-government relationships and unique tribal circumstances have impacted your success, if you will, as a tribe?
Well, I think it goes back to Mr. Watchman's point about having folks that understand tribal governance and policy in these departments administering these programs, right? And so, I mean, in the case of, ARPA or other COVID fundings, you had this large amount of capital that was made available, and then nobody knew how to disperse it and disperse it effectively. And there were no timelines tied to it as well. And so a lot of those opportunities got caught up or actually lost because those funds weren't deployed because you didn't have those specific resources within those departments. And one of the many hats that I wear is on the Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee, and we have a dedicated team with the Office of Native and Tribal Affairs that focuses on deployment of capital and programs that working within Treasury that have tribal experts employed within the department that are helping tribes and assisting with those programs and communicating directly with Treasury on policy issues.
I think that that is a fabulous idea, and you, in your testimony, provided some thoughts on designing programs with tribes in mind. But some of these programs already exist, and they simply aren't working. And that's what we want to figure out, how to make this work better. Do you have other ideas of how we could get this government-to-government relationship functioning better for the benefit of our members?
Yeah, one of the things that we're doing under the NFOA guides is looking at all of the various structures that have been established within, the various stacks and TACs and advisory councils, and seeing which ones are working. First of all, what are they all and where are they? Which ones are working, which best practices then we could take and apply to utilize across departments.
Well, we appreciate your advice and any guidance you can provide, and I would say that for the entire panel. Thank you very much for being here. I know I'm out of time, and I yield back.
Chairwoman's time has expired. At this time, the chair recognizes the ranking member from the state of New Mexico, Ms. Ledger-Fernandez, for 5 minutes. Ms. Ledger-Fernandez.
Thank you. And the testimony was really excellent, giving us a sense of why it is important. I really want to thank you, Mr. Harris, for bringing our perspective back to why do we have economic development in Indian country, and that it is a very different model than a for-profit for singular gain, right? It is a public purpose that we are doing this for, and it was done because the United States had tried to wipe out tribes. And when we finally decided as the United States that that was a bad idea, we passed the Indian Reorganization Act, and we recognized that we had so impoverished tribes that we needed to also try to create some economic development opportunities. And we did both the Section 16 and then we did the Section 17, saying let's create opportunities for tribal corporations for public benefit. And so thank you for bringing us back to the reason why we need economic development in Indian tribe. It's to benefit the entire tribal community. And then what then happens is you benefit the communities around you. As each of you would be able to say about my tribal economic business is such a great job creator for the people around me. So thank you for doing that. Both Mr. Watchman and Chair Butler talked about one program, which was the Tribal Energy, Department of Energy's Tribal Energy Loan Guarantee Program. You each highlighted some of the different problems with it, right? That we need to be able to layer funding, and we also need to make sure that it is not inflexible. I was very pleased that under the Inflation Reduction Act, working with NFOA, we were able to include my bill, the Energy Investment Act, right? Because we need to be able to make it easier and actually have direct loans rather than having to go outside and look for loan guarantees. Like, can we eliminate the red tape and have direct loans from the Treasury? But could each of you and separately say how this program, not my bill, but the existing one, why we have this problem? We could eliminate it if we eliminated some of the inflexibility that you counted out. I'll start with you, Chairman Butler.
Thank you, Congresswoman. I think the issue with the deployment came down to, as I spoke about earlier, with programs generally speaking, that there's no clear timelines that these funds need to be deployed by. And there's no sense of urgency in coordinating with tribes to understand what projects are available and assisting tribes in planning those. And so the resources aren't there in many cases, tribes that just don't have the resources and the technical expertise to understand how to navigate through the red tape of programs like this. And so I think having the right resources that are empowered to deploy the capital is critically important, and that just wasn't happening in the case of this program.
Mr. Watchman.
A couple of other components to the program. One was that, to provide bond guarantee, basically work with the capital markets. In many cases, the capital markets view these credits as specialty credits, and so it takes more resources to consummate a credit with a tribal government or a tribal energy project. And so, funding it internally obviously is the big key. But some of the challenges, though, was the groundwork, the pre-construction work. You have to hire lawyers, economists, architects, engineers, and that takes a lot of resources. And tribes right now are limited with, resources. So they're obviously trying to provide for health, education, welfare. So to bring on a new project, a new funding source, obviously creates a lot of challenges. And so, but I'm glad that the Department of Energy has moved toward indirect loans, but it's a long process. And so that's been the challenge when you work with projects on the outside. Things are pretty expedient, but to gain approvals on the tribal side, you got tribal council, you have to go out to get community meetings, and then you have the whole bureaucratic process of, the 25 CFR. There's many, many requirements that have to get done before you can deem a project shovel ready. And so these all obviously lend itself to, projects. And in fact, there's probably been very few projects yet that has been done under this program.
Right.
And so,
yeah, and thank you. And we've run out of time, but I think that was very much the point that the Chairwoman Silvas was making about what do you do on an upfront basis, right? And how do you make up for that from the small tribe to the big tribe to be able to have those resources up front? And I think that we should look at, is there a way for us to provide that kind of assistance, provide the kind of clearinghouse that Chairwoman Silvas was talking about. In New Mexico, our delegation has a grant finder, right? So we let every tribe in our state, but every person in our tribe can call to us and say, can you help us find that federal grant in the haystack, right? Because there's so many, and how can we actually create something that provides that assistance across the federal agencies would be an interesting work. With that, I've gone over my time, and I yield back.
That's an interesting idea. The gentlewoman's time has indeed expired. At this time, the chair would like to recognize the chairman of the full House Committee on Natural Resources, the gentleman from Arkansas, Mr. Westerman, for 5 minutes. Mr. Westerman.
Thank you, Chairman Hurd, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. We talk a lot about self-determination, and to me, economic development is the pathway to self-determination. Actually, I don't see how you have self-determination without having strong economic incentives and being able to provide jobs and economic growth. And Mr. Harris, you described federal contracting as a market-based alternative to direct federal aid. How does that model address self-determination differently than just traditional grant programs?
Thank you, Representative. And it's great to see you again. I had the honor of attending a meeting in Anchorage when you brought the committee up last year in August at the Alaska Native Heritage Center. So thank you for doing that.
Great trip.
The way I look at the federal contracting is it's another way to assist in the self-determination process and to assist the grant-making and formula programs that are already in place for our tribes and Native organizations. The way I really see this buffering self-determination is that by bringing in these funds, this is the ultimate ability for tribes, NHOs, and ANCs from very diverse areas, some so remote that we don't really have economic opportunities in conjunction with the federal government to do work both nationally and internationally, providing competitive prices, sometimes negotiated rates with the federal government, and bringing those benefits back to Alaska and to the other places that we work. And by bringing those benefits back, we're able to create jobs, provide dividends, provide infrastructure development in areas where we oftentimes have the worst economic development, unfortunately, because of our remoteness. We have the lowest levels of education and other items because we have been kind of trying to come back and rally around what was said earlier in bringing ourselves up to the standards and par with the rest of the United States. So for me, this really is the ability to aid self-determination by allowing us, whether it's at a board level or a tribal council level, to determine where those funds go and how they can best serve our local communities and our states.
Thank you, Mr. Butler. It's been talked about how departments and agencies administer numerous tribal economic development programs, but federal barriers often limit their effectiveness. I'm reminded of a conversation I had with a friend who's a tribal member, and their tribe is blessed with all these resources, and they've invested money to utilize these resources. And he was telling me they couldn't get the resources, and I was like, "Why? I don't get it. The resources are on the reservation. You've got the people and the infrastructure to utilize them. Why can't you get, he said, well, the BIA won't do the paperwork. And I said, well, why don't you all just do the paperwork and take the BIA out of the equation? He said, that's a great idea. Why don't you make that happen? So how does inadequate or inconsistent federal data affect these programs, and how much of a barrier are some of these agencies that are put there to help, how much of a barrier to tribal sovereignty are they in economic development?
Well, Chairman Westerman, it's great to see you. Always, I was just up in the Quechee area of Vermont, and I understand you're very fond of that as well. And so, hopefully, I'll be up there this summer, and I'll see you up there. But data is incredibly important, right? And without it, it's easy to say a program isn't working, or create an obstacle to deploying funds. You can say that, well, why would we deploy this if we're not going to get any results out of it? But if you're not tracking data, you don't know that, right? And so I don't know the answer to how we get better data. I think that's something that at NFOA we're committed to looking at and trying to understand why the collection is so difficult, and more importantly, how we can standardize it across agencies, because if we're looking at standard data, we can see where programs are working or not working, and how we can better cross-pollinate programs and working together. And so, in that sense of the impact on sovereignty, again, if a program lead or director isn't deploying or willing to work with the tribe because they don't feel, without the good data, that it's actually going to be beneficial, they might slow roll that program, or might just ignore it altogether. And I think that's what tribes are seeing when they're interacting with various members of the departments that you feel like you're just running your head up against the wall against, right? And you're stuck in a information gathering phase, and you're never moving forward with any actual movement because of that.
Thank you very much. I have a lot more questions, but no more time.
The gentleman's time has indeed expired. At this time, the chair would like to recognize the gentlewoman from the state of Washington, Ms. Randall, for 5 minutes. Ms. Randall.
Thank you so much, Chairman Hurd and Ranking Member Laguerre-Fernandez, for holding this hearing. We're here to talk about economic development, and I will get to that. But I just was struck by my colleague from Wyoming's remarks about how an agency's misunderstanding of tribal governments and tribal sovereignty can lead to negative outcomes, and couldn't help but say that we are seeing that on the ground in my district, in my state, as well as in Minnesota, the really challenging and dangerous interactions between Homeland Security agents and tribal nations, and a misunderstanding or disregard of sovereignty when detaining American citizens, tribal citizens, and coming onto reservation land. I've heard from women who are tribal leaders who are, taking advantage of the fact that there's one road in and off, on and off the reservation, and so we'll just go park their truck across the road because that is the best way to keep their community safe. And I'm glad and grateful that we're able to have this conversation about removing barriers and strengthening understanding as it relates to economic development, but want to ensure that we are able to have these conversations across agency interactions, ensuring that we are truly defending sovereignty. I know that our bureaucracy is vast and difficult to try and navigate for local governments, for tribal nations, particularly smaller tribal organizations. And we have to identify opportunities to streamline these processes and services wherever possible, especially to uphold our treaty and trust obligations and ensure that tribes can take advantage of federal resources and programs. In my district, we've seen incredible positive effects from the Recompete program, recently authorized by my predecessor, policy led by my predecessor. It's been critical to economically distressed communities like in the Olympic Peninsula to leverage federal investments to reinvigorate local economies. The Makah tribe has been a key partner in this work on the peninsula, but these programs are only as good as the funding they receive from Congress. and how the administration actually uses those funds or releases them, as the case may be. Unfortunately, over the past year, we've seen the Trump administration create confusion and chaos by illegally freezing these federal funds issued by Congress and reducing staffing capacity. Your testimony today, and thank you all for making the trip here, makes clear that flexibility, adequate federal funding, and reliable staffing are key to successful economic development. The National Center's assessment of this administration's impact on Indian country highlights this as well. One section of the report that really stood out for me was the discussion around the administration's abandonment of climate resiliency efforts. They noted that weakened agencies and tribal partnerships and insufficient funding have left tribal communities more vulnerable to climate change. Mr. Watchman, how important are partnerships between federal agency and tribes for implementing economic development programs, and how have staffing reductions over the past year affected these relationships?
Thank you, Madam Congressman. Staffing reductions have certainly created, like I said, a pause on many of the programs. Like, for example, out in Arizona, for example, the Hopi tribe was granted an enormous amount of funding for electrifying their community, but the funds were put on hold. Actually, the funds were taken away. So, the Hopi Nation now has very limited opportunities. Right now, they're trying to electrify their homes. In Indian country, especially in our area, we still have a lot of homes that don't have electricity, and so they have to use kerosene lamps and or generators and things of that nature. And so, the elimination of that program, basically, it's halting what Hopi is doing. In our case, the National Center, for example, we got a big grant to move forward tourism. And so that program got cut at the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So we were left in a lurch. What do? There's no communication, so we had to put our program on hold. In fact, we had to lay off 5 folks. We got the cooperative agreement 2 years ago. We made these big announcements around the country saying we're really going to push tourism. The BI office shut down, no funding. So unfortunately, we relocated a lot of folks from different parts of the country to our office. So now they're unemployed. And so obviously, a sad situation. We made a lot of promises. And so, but in general, Indian country, there's this unique relationship because you look at, the federal government. If you look at the federal government through the Bureau of Indian Affairs is our trustee. So they have a lot of say. You mentioned, tribes that our agreements, if you look at the land leases, they're actually BIA instruments. And so, we have to rely on the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Plus, there's all kinds of restrictions. For example, I have a small business in my little town of Navajo, New Mexico. It took 6 years just to get a business permit. And this business permit was in conjunction with the Navajo Nation and the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And so I could never figure out why it took 6 years, but finally 6 years later, I finally got a document that signed that I could operate a business. That takes way, way too long. And they tell me that the reason for that is there's so many layers and, a big process, red tape, if you will. And so that obviously stymied my business, and it creates a lot of, challenges for folks that want to create and come home. We do have a lot of folks that are leaving, but they want to come home to create businesses. But because of the partnership, if you will, with BIA, it's virtually impossible in many cases.
Thank you so much for that testimony, Mr. Watchman, and thank you for your grace, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
You're welcome. The gentleman's time has expired. At this time, the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Chairwoman Silvas, in your testimony, first, it's good to see you. In your testimony, you said in several instances the Shivwits Band has become aware of federal programs only after application deadlines have passed or after funds have already been awarded to other entities. Could you give me a few examples of what those instances were, just so we can help concretely see opportunities that were missed?
Yes, we had a current one that came up just recently, and that was the IHBG grant. We found out about that in early December, and that grant was actually due January 15 of 2026. So
what would that have been for?
Housing.
Housing.
Housing, yes. It's a much-needed much needed on our reservation. So that was one thing that we're constantly on the lookout for, is better housing for our memberships. And with the notice that we received in just a short time frame to get everything in, and being a small band with very little resources, it was just not possible for us to do that in time.
How do federal agencies typically communicate with the Shivwits Band today about these opportunities, or do they not? Is it up to you to go out and find these opportunities?
Yes, there's no communication at all. Previously, in my experience, what I've seen is the federal government will email a generic letter to tribal nations. But what they forget to, or what they're not knowledgeable about, is when we have new elections. So we're having all of these emails go to previous chair people, and then by the time that we're able to get that change, it's we find out about grants too late, and there's just got to be a better process in that.
Great. Thank you, Chairwoman Silvas. Chairman Butler, you said something really interesting in your testimony, that total assistance to tribes is unknown. That's certainly something that we ought to have a handle on. That's a very interesting bit of information. I wanted to chat with you, though, quickly about predictable timelines and how important they are to financing, contracting, and also workforce planning, particularly in those tribal communities that have a limited administrative capacity. Where do federal economic development projects most commonly stall, and what aspects of the process are usually responsible for that?
Thank you, Chairman. Great question. It typically stalls in the planning process, right? And I think, listening to Chairwoman Silvas, Silvas is exactly what we're trying to address in this conversation. We're trying to address at our various organizations, and making sure that it's fair across the board to all tribes that need access to resources and these programs. And so the fact that a smaller nation doesn't have those in-house resources to, one, even find the grants and programs that are available, and then two, to fill out go by the process and understand the process and go through the applications, there's no resources to assist them. So there needs to be more focused technical resources that are available to tribes, and not just a blanket, here's a program, and if you hear about it, great, and if not, tough luck. And it's just, that's the way it's structured today. And so even if you're lucky enough to hear, and like we have a grants team at Mashantucket, and we still miss thousands of opportunities. So I can't even imagine what Chairwoman goes through on a daily basis, and the lack of opportunity that she sees in her community. But having those resources, and that's what our orgs try to fill in those gaps, but it's just not enough.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chairman Butler. Mr. Harris, from your experience, what specific features of federal contracting, I'm thinking of things like speed, predictability, reduced administrative friction, what things most clearly distinguish successful native contracting outcomes from programs that fail to deliver lasting economic benefits?
I would really highlight the fact that with the 8A program, we're in a smaller field of competition, therefore it allows the smaller organizations that are just growing, and even some of us that are much larger, to have an opportunity to compete on a more even playing field. And two, something that I think provides a great benefit back to all of the agencies and the federal government is when we do these sole source opportunities, we can cut our procurement timelines from anywhere from 12 to 16 months on a competitive award down. I've seen them done in 15 days in extreme circumstances, but typically 30 to 60 days. We're able to negotiate pricing with the federal government so that there's an open field and nobody sees or nobody is aware of any inability to hit the mark in terms of negotiated pricing. And we're able also to negotiate scope, so there's a clear level of expectation across the customer and the federal government that allows us to interact more as equal partners.
Okay, that's very helpful. Thank you. And my time has now expired. At this time, I would like to recognize the gentlewoman from the state of Arizona, Ms. Grijalva, for 5 minutes. Ms. Grijalva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathered on Indigenous land and honoring the tribal nations who have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. That acknowledgement must be more than ceremonial. It must be reflected in our laws, our budgets, our priorities, and our commitment to justice. I am proud to represent Arizona's 7th Congressional District, home to the vibrant and resilient tribal nations, including Cocopah Tribe, the Quechan Tribe of the Fort Yuma Indian Reservation, the Tonatim Nation, and Pasquayaqui Tribe, whose histories, cultures, and leadership are inseparable from the story of this region. Tribal sovereignty is not a privilege granted by the federal government. It is an inherent right, affirmed by treaties and enshrined by the Constitution. But sovereignty without resources is hollow. For generations, tribal communities have faced chronic underinvestment that has constrained economic growth and limiting opportunity. This is a result of that deliberate policy choices, and today this administration is making exceedingly difficult for tribal nations to prosper. We can and must do better. True tribal sovereignty demands more than words. It requires meaningful federal investments that empower self-determination, support economic development, and ensure equitable access to opportunity. That's why access to capital is so critical. That's why federal programs are specifically designed to meet the unique needs of tribal nations must be strengthened, not dismantled. The 8A program is intended to help tribal nations overcome historic economic exclusion and build sustainable long-term enterprises. The Pasquayaqui tribe in my district has raised concern surrounding the 8A program and around the real hardships under this administration's actions. Many tribal nations are sovereign, but keep having negative consequences of being classified as part of this administration's cutting of what they consider DEI. Mr. Watchman, can you describe on the record what losing the 8A program would mean for tribal businesses and workers, and how your organization is working to ensure the continued successful implementation of the program?
Thank you. Thank you. Through the National Center, obviously, we've been working hand in hand with the Native American Contractors Association, and so the 8A program has been a very effective and productive program for many of the Alaska Native corporations and our Native-owned businesses. And so basically, it's a program that helps to jumpstart a lot of our Native-owned businesses. And so with the program shutting down, obviously, as was pointed out by the gentleman who represents the Native American Contractors Association, that would mean big cuts in their revenue sources. Being a member of the Navajo Nation, we do have an 8A. It's a smaller one, but if the 8A program is cut, that means half the workforce, half of the team members for the Navajo Nation's 8A program would have to look for jobs elsewhere. And so this program has been very, very effective. And what that means is that these 8A programs are able to employ Native members, these 8A programs, and the revenue and the profits that are generated is used to offset tribal government costs. Because you got to remember, a lot of tribes don't have a tax base like regular states and counties. So without a tax base, we don't have a revenue source to operate government programs. And so big cuts, if the program is cut, you'll see a lot of impacts to tribal government around the country. And so there's very, very few other options. Gaming is one, but with the 575 tribes here in the country, only about a third benefit from gaming. The rest need these entities like 8As to help provide, for the health, education, and welfare of the tribal governments.
Thank you. Tribal nations need meaningful voice in federal decision-making, and consultation must be timely, transparent, and effective. As Chairman Butler's testimony notes, some federal departments and agencies treat consultation as a box-checking exercise, which is unacceptable. Chairman Butler, can you explain what distinguishes meaningful consultation from listening sessions, and why it is important that all federal agencies receive training in government-to-government consultation practices, as your testimony recommends?
Yeah, I think I would recognize the poster child of success in that is the Treasury Department. And again, what we've done with the Treasury Tribal Advisory Committee and the Office of Native and Tribal Affairs, we take consultation seriously. We engage on multiple occasions tribal leaders directly, and then the feedback from those tribal leaders on the programs that we're looking at, and recently the GWE rules and the tribally chartered corporations, they get inserted into the actual rules. And so much so that the TTAC itself, we had to advise to pull some things out because they put everything in the kitchen sink in, and so it was great. And the way that they engaged through utilizing the direct resources of the Office of Tribal and Native Affairs was key, because having experts, tribal experts in the room, in the department, assisting with that communication and those consultations was critical.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. At this time, the chair would like to recognize the gentleman from the state of Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg, for 5 minutes. Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for being here as a panel to provide us oversight, insight, and so thank you so much. I want to thank the committee as well for the opportunity for this oversight, because having both the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi as well as the Nottawasepi Band of the Potawatomi Indians in my district, I know it is important that we understand how many support opportunities there are for municipal governments, the employment of thousands of people in Southwest Michigan, the critical services that are provided to their members that I've had the opportunity to see as they function is extremely important. So a hearing like this to make sure that the array of federal programs are used appropriately to assist and not to hinder is very important. Ms. Silvas, in your testimony, you explain how projects are technically open to all tribes, but due to requirements of the programs like staffing, technical issues, the expertise or lack of expertise there, financial reserves, smaller tribes are often unable to participate. What program design features tend to advantage larger, better resourced tribes, even when programs are nominally open to all tribes?
Right now, I don't feel comfortable with answering that question, so if I can get back with you with a written.
Okay, that would be helpful. I'd open that to any others who would like to answer that question again. What program design features tend to advantage larger tribes? I'll wait for your response on that.
Yeah, Congressman Wahlberg, one, just recognizing the point that you made, that the tribal economies aren't just about tribal economies. It's about prosperity for the surrounding regions as well in the state, and that's an important fact to note. But in building to your question, you said it's for large tribes.
They tend to advantage larger tribes. Is that true or not?
Well, no, it depends on resources, right? I think larger tribes in the sense of resources that are available, that's where the advantages are, and that's the point that we're talking about, that we need to balance, the opportunity for all tribes and having the technical expertise available to all tribes and streamlining processes so that it's much more understandable for everyone to take advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, they're nominally open to everyone, but how to get that is the concern.
Yep, exactly.
How could programs be structured so smaller tribes have a realistic opportunity to participate without disadvantaging tribes that already have capacity? Ms. Silvas?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
How could programs be structured so smaller tribes have a realistic opportunity to participate without disadvantaging tribes that already have capacity? And I could open it to anyone who would care to answer that.
I'll take a stab at it.
Mr. Watchman.
I was chief of staff for 2 former Navajo presidents, and obviously, well, not obvious, but larger tribes do have a few more resources, few more staff people, to be able to look at these different opportunities. But as a former banker working with the smaller tribes, a lot of tribes are bare bone. A lot of tribes just have very, very limited resources. So, the programs that they fund are, like, for example, the police and social services, education. And then again, it's really hard to get challenges. Also, our young natives are graduating, but they're not coming back to the reservation because of limited economic opportunities, limited education. So you have, in many cases, it's really hard to find qualified, competent, skilled tribal members to come home and work for the tribe. I see that quite a bit on Navajo. A lot of folks say, well, I want to raise a family, but the education, things are terrible, so why go home? So that's one of the challenges that many reservations face, including my reservation, is how to get the talent back to the reservation. Well, you go back to the reservation, it's hard to, So the smaller tribes, in many cases, just don't have the resources to hire the talent and to employ those folks. And so, yes, there's a lot of opportunities out there, but the smaller tribes, as you're suggesting, do have challenges in getting things done. But the bigger tribes also, have also challenges, and so it's just a challenge. So how do you fix that? How do you improve that? I think, as was suggested, more consultation, more notice that there's resources available, and in many cases, in my prior work, in many cases, there's turnover in the federal government. So I joke about it, but sometimes you have to do Indian 101, and that's to train the federal programs as to how reservations work. There's 574 different tribes. Every tribe is different. And so it takes unique challenges to understand how this tribe works versus this tribe. Yeah. So that's my quick answer.
I appreciate
to the question.
that.
Thank you.
My time has expired, and I yield back.
This gentleman's time has expired. At this time, I want to thank each of our witnesses for your valuable testimony and also my colleagues for their questions. Members of the committee may have additional questions for you witnesses, and we would ask that you respond to those in writing. Under Committee Rule 3, members of the committee must submit questions to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. on Friday, February 6th, 2026. The hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. Is there any further business?
Mr. Chair, I'd like to seek unanimous consent to enter into the record Executive Order 14-112. Is it on? Wrong one. Oh. Mr. Chair, I'd like to seek unanimous consent to enter into the record Executive Order 14112 issued by President Biden titled titled Reforming Federal Funding and Support for Tribal Nations to Better Embrace our Trust Responsibilities and Promote the Next Era of Tribal Self-Determination. This executive order, which as you can see by its title, is intended to do some of the work we're talking about here, was rescinded by President Trump on March 2025. And I thought about it because of your questions with regards to the need to have like a clearinghouse. The revocation, in essence, revoked the tribal access to capital clearinghouse that came about because of the executive order. The executive order asked to look at additional funding needed to carry out the kind of projects we're talking about here. How can agencies have waivers of their own policies, which they are authorized to do, but what kind of waivers so we can have better tribal access to federal funding? How do we promote contracting and compacting? And these are the kinds of things that I think are very useful that were laid out in the executive order, which shouldn't be controversial, which I think we should look at actually codifying so that they are not dependent on one president wanting to rescind all the prior president's executive orders, regardless of the merit. But these are the kinds of things we're talking about that hopefully we can work together on a bipartisan basis. Thank you for triggering that in my mind with your
worthy of discussion without objection. That will become part of the record, as well as that testimony there you just gave. Thank you, Ranking Member Ledger Fernandez. If there is no further business, without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thank you all.